Jasmine Crockett stood asleep centermost in the Supreme Cloister chamber, ablaze lights highlighting her adventurous red clothing as she faced Archimand's John Roberts Hedden. Her affection was racing, but her eyes absolutely steady. Aloof abnormal before, Roberts had approved to shut her bottom word with the aciculate congresswoman. That's enough. His articulation bounced off the marble walls like a admonishing shot. The abrupt abeyance, beatific ripples of whispers through the arranged courtroom. Bodies exchanging glances, a striction bushing every bend of the room. Crockett absorbed her addendum tight, but she didn't flinch. Continuing afore 9 justices and hundreds of bodies watching, Roberts, with his lifetime arrangement and 18 years active America's accomplished court, was assured he could black out this aboriginal appellation adumbrative from Texas. But Crockett, armed with her accomplishments as a prosecutor and her determined acceptance in what the architecture absolutely says, saw this as her moment to prove him asleep amiss for aggravating to abolish her. She stepped forward, her articulation acid through the silence, bright and strong. With all due respect, Mr. Archjustice, the architecture doesn't accord you permission to black out an adopted adumbrative who's talking about voting rights. The allowance went absolutely silent. Roberts's face froze, acutely not assured such a absolute claiming to his ascendancy based on the architecture itself. This wasn't aloof some procedural altercation anymore. This was about the basal attack of what it agency to be an adjudicator and serve the people. And it was Crockett's moment to avert not aloof herself, but the actual abstraction of autonomous representation adjoin what looked like administrative overreach. The Supreme Cloister alcove glowed with that austere academic lighting. The admirers falling into a close calm as Archimand's John Roberts sat adapted in the average of the 9 justices. His atramentous bathrobe was altogether pressed, his boring aciculate and abounding of authority. The camera boring panned above the room, communicable broadcast whispers ascent from the arcade as the cloister agent announced. The Atonement Cloister recognizes Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, actualization as acquaintance of the court. Roberts gave a slight nod, a bound smile about arresting as he said, Representative Crockett from Texas's 30th District. You accept 10 minutes. His accent agitated all the weight of his position. A conservative-leaning Archimand's, appointed by President Bush aback in 2005, known for his accurate step-by-step admission to accustomed decisions and his focus on managing how the attainable sees the court. Jasmine Crockett absolved up to the belvedere with abstinent steps, her red clothing continuing out badly adjoin the aphotic copse autogenous of the chamber. At 42, this apprentice congresswoman from Dallas agitated herself with the aplomb of addition, who'd spent years as a civilian rights advocate and accompaniment representative. Known for her direct, non-nonsense style, she'd fabricated a name for herself as a assent articulation on built-in issues, abnormally voting rights, the actual affair at the affection of today's hearing. Thank you, Mr. Archjustice, and may it amuse the court, she began, her abysmal articulation bushing the chamber. I angle afore you today, not aloof as a congresswoman, but as addition who's apparent with her own eyes how the abolition of voting rights has taken abroad the choir of communities above Texas and our absolute nation. She paused. Authoritative eye acquaintance with anniversary amends afore continuing. The case you're attractive at today isn't aloof about abstruse rules and regulations. It's about whether we still accept in the basal affiance that all Americans deserve according admission to casting their ballots. Roberts confused hardly in his chair, his announcement unchanged, but his eyes' absorption aloof a tiny bit, about airy unless you were absolutely watching. This audition on Williams' adjoined Texas Acclamation Commission wasn't declared to be some high-profile case. It was abstruse about Aborigine ID requirements, article Roberts apparently hoped would canyon with about any attainable attention. But Crockett accepting complex had afflicted everything, bringing civic media absorption and attorneys arranged with people. Crockett stepped hardly to the side, pointing at the architecture displayed in the chamber. As she continued, when the Voting Rights Act was gutted by this actual cloister in Shelby County, we were promised that added protections would still be there. Yet actuality we are 10 years later, seeing absolutely the affectionate of Aborigine abolishment the VRA was advised to prevent. The admirers tensed up as Roberts leaned forward, his microphone communicable his aciculate animation at her absolute advertence to one of his best arguable decisions. The stakes of this battle aback became bright clear. This wasn't aloof about one specific case. It was an absolute claiming to the absolute Roberts Court's admission to voting rights law. Amens. Elena Kagan glanced over at Roberts, afresh aback at Crockett, her announcement suggesting she could see the brewing battle coming. Amens. Thomas sat altogether still while Amens Jackson aback leaned forward, acutely affianced by what Crockett was saying. The political capacity of the cloister were acceptable arresting in absolute time. The Texas law in advanced of you today, Crockett continued, her articulation accepting stronger, creates barriers that hit Atramentis and Latino voters the hardest. My capacity and the affirmation is overwhelming. Back 23% of Atramentis Texans don't accept the specific ID this law requires. Compared to aloof 4.7% of white Texans, we're not talking about aloof regulations. We're talking about a modern-day poll tax. Robert's jaw anchored as cameras bent his growing discomfort. This wasn't the dry, technical, accustomed altercation he'd expected. Crockett was speaking in apparent accent about ancestral disparities in a way that hit home with the bodies watching. Even worse for Roberts, she was abetment up every distinct point with specific numbers and built-in principles. Congresswoman, he cut in. His accent clipped. Amused stick to the specific accustomed questions the cloister is considering. The aboriginal attack to alter her had been made. A attenuate admonishing that she was activity into area, the arch amends capital to avoid. Crockett nodded respectfully but didn't back down. Mr. Arch Justice, the specific accustomed catechism is whether this law violates the 14th and 15th Amendments. And we can't acknowledgement that afterwards talking about these disparities. She didn't absence a beat access aback to her notes. Back 87-year-old veterans who voted in every distinct acclamation aback advancing home from Korea. Aback can't casting a ballot, we've got a built-in crisis on our hands. The arcade erupted in murmurs, bound silenced by the blast of Roberts's gavel. The battle was now absolutely out in the open. Crockett, the assent aldermanic brilliant and above civilian rights attorney, was arduous Roberts. The arch amends alive to adapt American acclamation law. This wasn't a loofah accustomed altercation anymore. It was an axiological affray over who gets to ascertain what built-in voting protections absolutely mean. As cameras captured the tension, political reporters' fingers were aerial above keyboards. CNN's on-screen altercation already read, Showdown at SCOTUS. Crockett challenges Roberts on voting rights. The date was set for a built-in battle that would anon backfire above America's political landscape. The restriction in the Supreme Cloister alcove kept architecture as Crockett affiliated her presentation, absolutely laying out how the Texas Aborigine ID law created barrier afterwards barrier for boyhood voters. She stood firm, gesturing to abstracts archive her aggregation had prepared, assuming abrupt ancestral differences in Aborigine admission above Texas counties. When we attending at how this law absolutely works in practice, she explained, her articulation abiding and clear. We acquisition that in counties with college Atramentis and Latino populations. DMV offices, area you get an accurate ID except cut hours, cool connected delay times, and they're generally amid afar abroad from attainable transportation. This isn't some accident. It's an arrangement that repeats all above the state. Robert confused in his seat, acutely afflictive with how anon Crockett was acclamation ancestral disparities. The arch amens had connected adopted talking about voting regulations afterwards, bringing Chase into it. Absorption instead on states' rights to run their own elections. Crockett's admission was banishment absolutely the chat he'd spent years aggravating to avoid. Congresswoman, he disconnected again, his accent bluff this time. The cloister is acquainted of the accepted statistics. Amuse abode the specific built-in assay that should administer to this case. This wasn't aloof him aggravating to alter the chat procedurally. It was an attack to move the altercation abroad from absolute people's adventures and aback to abstruse accustomed doctrine. The arcade tensed up, acquainted the aboriginal absolute affray amid the able arch amends and the apprentice congresswoman. Amens. Barrett glanced at Roberts while Amens Sotomayor leaned forward, watching Crockett with bright interest. Crockett paused, took a sip of water, and nodded respectfully. Mr. Arch Justice, I'm acclamation absolutely. The built-in assay beneath both Arlington Heights and what's larboard of the Voting Rights Act, abominable. A pulse accumulated with actual patterns. Creates the anticipation that requires austere scrutiny. She hadn't backed bottomward one bit. Instead, she affiliated her affirmation anon to accustomed precedent. Roberts's face anchored aloof slightly, about imperceptibly. The cloister is accomplished in the precedents. Congresswoman, with respect, Your Honor, Crockett replied, her articulation accepting strength. President abandoned affairs back, it's absolutely applied. In Bruno, this cloister accustomed abominable impact, but still upheld Arizona's regulations. On establishing why this case requires a altered after effect based on how astringent the appulse is, the aboriginal absolute beachcomber of murmurs advanced through the courtroom. Crockett had a non-referenced addition arguable Roberts cloister accommodation that had attenuated voting protections. Cameras captured Amen's Kagan comatose hardly while Amen's Alo frowned, creating a breech awning moment that would afterwards go viral. Roberts broke his microphone. Congresswoman Crockett, this cloister decides cases based on built-in principles, not action preferences. Amuse abide with your accustomed argument. His accent had developed dismissive, about condescending, a adapted aberration that would anon become obvious. Crockett nodded, afresh angry to her best able evidence. Let me appearance you what built-in attack attending like an absolute life, Your Honor. She signaled to her aide, who handed out abstracts to the justices. Afore you are affidavit statements from 72 Texas voters, who were denied their adapted to vote, admitting authoritative assorted good faith efforts to exceed with this law. She captivated up the aboriginal statement. Mary Wilson, 84 years old, built in at home in East Texas in 1939, back-bearing certificates weren't frequently accustomed to atramentous babies in the Jim Crow South. She's voted in every acclamation aback 1965, but got angry abroad in 2022 because her name on her baptismal certificate, the abandoned almanac of her birth, has a altered average antecedent than her amusing Aegis card. Crockett confused to the abutting document. James Fentes, a disabled adept who couldn't renew his authorization because the abandoned DMV Oral 50 afar of his rural home isn't wheelchair accessible. They told him to drive to the abutting county. With anniversary example, Crockett was accomplishing article powerful. Connecting abstruse accustomed attack to absolute animal experiences, authoritative the built-in violations absurd to besom off as bald technicalities. The arcade was absolutely captivated, and several journalists were above board recording every word. Robertson's backbone was acutely cutting thin. He glanced at the clock, afresh disconnected again. Congresswoman, abandoned stories, while compelling, don't authorize a built-in pattern. We charge to abode the accustomed standard, not affecting appeals. The adjournment of these voters' adventures as affecting appeals created absolutely the aperture Crockett had been cat and mouse for. She straightened her shoulders, looked anon at Roberts, and delivered her aboriginal, absolutely confrontational response. Mr. Archjustice, with all due respect, the architecture wasn't accounting for abstruse accustomed theories. It was accounting to assure absolute Americans like Ms. Wilson and Mr. Fuentes. Back the 15th alteration says, the adapted to vote shall not be denied or bound based on race. It doesn't accommodate and barring for annoying facts or afflictive truths. The arcade exploded in whispers. Amens. Jackson looked up acutely while Amens Thomas, usually silent, a side article to Amens Alito. The battle had now escalated above procedural altercation into axiological questions about how built-in attack should absolutely be interpreted. Robert's face ablaze hardly as he accomplished for his gavel. Congresswoman, I'll admonish you that this is a accustomed proceeding, not a aldermanic hearing. Amuse advance adapted decorum. Rather than abetment down, Crockett nodded and angled down. Adapted decorum, Your Honor, includes acknowledging the animal impulse of built-in violations. I'm not actuality for abstruse theory. I am actuality because absolute voters in my commune are actuality systematically denied their best axiological right. She angry to amends Barrett. Amens Barrett, in your acceptance hearing, you said the adapted to vote is a axiological built-in guarantee. Yet the law in advance of you today has demonstrably prevented bags of acceptable voters from applying that right. How can that possibly survive built-in review? Roberts anon stepped in, his articulation sharp. Congresswoman Crockett, you will abode your arguments to the cloister as a whole, not abandoned justices, and you will stop allurement the justices' questions directly. The restriction in the allowance hit a breaking point. Roberts was now acutely frustrated, accepting approved assorted times to ascendancy Crockett's presentation afterward success. The built-in break of Admiral was actuality activated in absolute time. A arch amends aggravating to advance ascendancy over a affiliate of Congress who collapsed out banned to be silenced. Crockett nodded again, but her expressions backward resolute. I apologize for the absolute question, Mr. Archjustice. Let me adapt for the absolute court. How can any law that demonstrably prevents bags of acceptable voters from casting their ballots possibly survive assay beneath the 14th and 15th Amendments? Roberts leaned forward, his backbone acutely exhausted. Congresswoman Crockett, you accept again abandon the court's advice on how to present your argument. If you cannot chase this court's procedures, your time will be cut short. The blackmail afraid in the air. A arch amends aggressive to blackout and adopted a dumbrative of the bodies during an audition about voting rights. The irony wasn't absent on anyone in the arcade area. Several civilian rights leaders were sitting. Cameras captured everything, including the reactions of the added justices, several of whom looked afflictive with Roberts's approach. Crockett stood altogether still for a moment, afresh accomplished into her binder and pulled out a certificate cipher in that allowance expected, an archetype of the architecture itself. Mr. Archjustice, she said, her articulation now calm but firm. Afore you cut my time short, I anticipate we should both brace ourselves on a certificate that comes afore both your ascendancy and mine. The Supreme Cloister alcove fell into an acute blackout as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett captivated up the Constitution, her abiding boring bound on arch amends Roberts. The moment crackled with tension. A apprentice, a dumbrative adverse bottom, were the nation's top administrative administrator, with the founding certificate amid them. Mr. Archamends Crockett began her articulation bright and unwavering. Article 1 of this architecture establishes Congress as a co-equal annex of government. Back I allege actuality today, I'm not aloof accomplishing so as an advocate afore the court, but as a dumbrative of 750,000 Americans whose voting rights are anon afflicted by this case. Roberts's announcement darkened. Congresswoman, your cachet as the affiliate of Congress doesn't admission you appropriate advantage in this courtroom. All advocates afore this cloister are accountable to the aforementioned rules. Crockett didn't hesitate. With respect, Your Honor, it doesn't admission me appropriate privilege, but it does admission me a built-in assignment to allege for my capacity back their axiological rights are actuality threatened. She captivated the architecture higher. The founders created 3 co-equal branches accurately to anticipate anyone from silencing another. The arcade erupted in murmurs. Several justices confused uncomfortably. Amens Kagan's eyebrows went up hardly while Amens Sudayor leaned advanced with attainable interest. Roberts' face ablaze with about independent frustration. He broke his gavel sharply. Congresswoman Crockett, this is my final warning. Abode the accustomed questions afore this cloister, or I will end your argument. What happened abutting would become the moment replayed on every account approach oral the hour. Crockett, instead of abetment down, anxiously opened her archetype of the architecture to a apparent page. Mr. Archjustice, she said, her articulation now stronger and added deliberate. I am acclamation the best axiological accustomed catechism afore not aloof this court, but our absolute democracy. Article 1, Section 2 establishes that associates of Congress anon represent the people. The 15th alteration prohibits abstinent the adapted to vote based on race. And the 14th alteration guarantees according aegis beneath law. She took a footfall afterpiece to the bench. Back you abused to black out me for speaking about how my capacity or actuality denied their built-in adapted to vote. You're not aloof actionable cloister procedure. You're embodying the actual built-in crisis I came actuality to address. Complete blackout fell over the chamber. The battle had confused above a bald altercation about attorneys' rules. Crockett had masterfully reframed the absolute barter as a built-in attack amid branches of government, with herself arresting autonomous representation a joint administrative overreach. Robert sat motionless, acutely bent off bouncer by this built-in framing of his attempts to ascendancy her presentation. Afore he could respond, Crockett continued, her articulation acquisition strength. The Texas law afore you today has prevented an estimated 278,000 acceptable voters from casting ballots. In my commune alone, 42,000 voters, predominantly Atramentis and Latino Americans, faced barriers that the 15th alteration absolutely forbids. This isn't about procedure, Your Honor. This is about whether the Constitution's promises are absolute or aloof theoretical. She angry to abode the abounding court, a adapted move that prevented Roberts from actualization to be her sole opponent. This cloister has said that voting is bactericide of all rights. If you aphorism that states can actualize barriers that demonstrably anticipate hundreds of bags of acceptable Americans from voting, decidedly back those barriers disproportionately oppulse ancestral minorities. Afresh, what absolutely does the 15th alteration protect? Amens. Jackson nodded about imperceptibly while Amens Barrett appeared to be demography-abundant notes. The activating in the allowance had absolutely shifted. Crockett was no best on the defensive. By ambrosial anon to built-in principles, she put Roberts in the position of appearing to argue the actual certificate they'd all affidavit to uphold. Roberts approved to achieve control. Congresswoman, your time is about expired. Amuse achieve your argument. I'll achieve with this, Mr. Archimans Crockett replied, her articulation now resonating with conviction. The Texas law requires forms of ID that 23% of Atramentis Texans and 27% of Latino Texans don't accept compared to aloof 4.7% of white Texans. It closes ID offices in boyhood neighborhoods while befitting them attainable in mostly white areas. It rejects affiliated IDs while accepting gun licenses. She paused, authoritative eye acquaintance with anniversary justice. If a law systematically prevents one ancestral accumulation from voting at 3 to bristles times the amount of another, it violates the apparent altercation of the 15th Amendment. And if this cloister can't see that, afresh it's not interpreting the Constitution. It's afterlighted. Robert's face hardened. Congresswoman Crockett, that's enough. Your time has expired. This was the moment. Roberts's attack to cut her off, to black out an adopted adumbrative discussing built-in voting protections, the actual act that would anon be accursed above the nation and burn a firestorm about administrative overreach. Crockett stood altogether still, captivation the architecture in one duke and her microphone in the other. Rather than arguing or accepting defensive, she artlessly stated, Chief Justice, the architecture doesn't accord you the ascendancy to black out an adopted adumbrative discussing the 15th alteration and a case about voting rights. That alteration exists absolutely, because bodies in ability accept consistently approved to black out those angry for according representation. If you begin this breakdown of the celebrated battle amid Jasmine Crockett and John Roberts enlightening, don't balloon to like and subscribe to our approach for added all-embracing political analysis. Comment beneath with your thoughts on this built-in showdown and who you anticipate ability be the abutting being to accomplish account-arresting voting rights at the accomplished levels of government. Your assurance helps us accumulate bringing you these acute belief about the advancing action to assure America's autonomous foundations. Retry. Claude can accomplish mistakes. Amuse bifold analysis responses.